What up, turds? It's Mr. Teacuple and Mr. Carnahan, and we are presenting two of your virtual lessons. We're pretty pumped about this. We decided that we're going to try to get together and talk to you about the final stages of 8th grade social studies, where we cover what kind of gets the Civil War off and running, and then some information about the Civil War, and hopefully that's going to have you guys set up for next year as you head into high school. Ain't that right, Mr. Teacuple?
Oh yeah. So thanks everybody for watching. Make sure that the whole video and everything that we say, this is going to be a little bit dumbed down per se, because this guy right here doesn't know a whole lot about causes of the Civil War. Mr. Carnahan may know a little more about what he's talking about, but so we're going to start out with just kind of a recap. So we started the year with basically Jamestown, 1607, first colony, permanent colony. And since about 12 years after that, in 1619, slavery has been in the United States. And if you're in my 7th grade class or Mr. Carnahan's, I hope that you've learned how throughout history people became slaves. The number one reason is they lost in war or battle. The second reason is, and by the way, this is all kind of dumbed down a little bit. This is just generic stuff. The second reason is they were criminals, so they broke the law. And the third reason is they owed money. They were debtors. Up until about, I believe, the 14th Amendment, debtors' prisons can no longer be a thing. So we really don't have that anymore. But basically, before the 14th Amendment, we're looking at the Founding Fathers. They had slaves. Not to say that that's okay, it's not. When we ratified the U.S. Constitution, my 8th graders definitely know, I hope, that there were some compromises made. And one of those was the three-fifths compromise. And I know Mr. Carnahan's talked about that because I've been in his room and I've seen it on the board. So Mr. Carnahan, what was that about? 3/5?
Just, and yes, I was going to say, when you said, I know that we've talked, I spent a lot of time with my 8th graders saying that it always came back to a compromise. Everything, in order to get anything done, you have to have a compromise. Just like right now with all that we're going through with the Corona and COVID, and the government's trying to decide how to give money to people, you hear the word stimulus, and people, you guys at home know that your parents have talked about maybe $1,200 or an amount of money to try to help as people aren't working. All that stuff has to be approved through our government, and Democrats and Republicans are definitely, if it ever takes time, it's because each side has stuff they want, and in order to get it to so that they can vote and agree, they have to come to compromise. And I know that many of my kids know the 3/5 compromise was that it was all about the fact of how are we going to count slaves when it comes to counting how many people are in your state. Why is it important to know how many people are in your state? Because you get representatives to speak for your state based on your number of how many people live in your state. So you want as many people counted as possible so you can have representatives, because those people, when they go to the federal government, they're the ones to vote for things that they think's what's best for your state. So the deal with the South and with slavery was the southern states wanted to add slaves in their population, in their count, so that they would have more representatives to have more votes. And the northern states were going, no, you can't add your slaves. You don't even count them as people, but now you want to count them as people when it comes to representation. So the compromise had to be that, okay, for every 5 slaves, we'll get to count that as 3 people. Correct?
Yeah.
Basically.
Sounds right. So that was one major compromise, was the 3/5 compromise to appease the South. And also to outlaw the slave trade starting in the year 1808. So like 20 years after this agreement to ratify the U.S. Constitution. Then we have, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. We have Thomas Jefferson, who becomes president, and he basically allows for the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, doubles the size of the United States. And then we have all this territory that is going to be settled, and then eventually we're going to apply for statehood, which brings us to the problem of having some slave states and some free states. So we have our first major event or cause of the Civil War, in which we haven't talked about this year in U.S. history. And it's going to revolve around the idea of popular sovereignty, in which people should be able to choose what's best for their state. But Mr. Carnahan's going to start out with the first event. And in this instance, Missouri is statehood.
Yeah, this slide right here, these were Mr. Teacouple's slides that we're using here. Again, guys, this is the first time we've done this, so I don't know exactly yet what you're seeing on your screen. I'm hoping I'm doing this correctly, but I have a slide up here called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And the deal was that before Missouri finally had enough people so that they could become a state, and I know we've talked about that too. How many? I think if it was originally, and what's wild, Teacouple, is I know some kids that are watching this remember the number better than me, but I think you had to have 60,000 people to apply to become a state. And so if that was still the case then, that number grew. Like now it's much higher. But Missouri finally got enough people to become a state. And if I've got a cursor here on my screen, Missouri is right here. And you can see a red line under Missouri. It's under Missouri, Kentucky, and Virginia. There's a red line there with the number 3630 in. That's a degree of latitude. But anyway, Missouri was like, okay, we're ready to be a state, and we want to be a slave state. And that threw a wrench in everything, because before Missouri said we're ready to be a state, we had 22 states that made up the United States, and 11 of them were free states. You couldn't have slavery, and 11 of them were slave states. And so now we've got a big problem, because we're going to add our 23rd state, and they want to be a slave state. And the free states are saying, no, we're not going to allow that, because so much of the government, so much of the decision making that was going on always, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Teacouple, but everything kind of had a hand in slavery whenever they were making decisions. Was slavery a part of it? Is that why the northern states were so much into saying, no, you can't have more slave states than free states?
Yeah, I mean, it had everything to do with representation, as you talked about earlier. The power they didn't want the power to be tipped in favor of the southern slaveholders. The North wanted the power, and they wanted the power to remain in the North. And so, as we've talked about many times this year, there's regional differences between the North and the South. There's economy that is based on business in the North, and in the South, it's based on farming. And a lot of that labor, most of that labor was free. It was slave labor. And so the issues are what Mr. Carnahan's talking about. The issues are always that struggle to compromise.
And so what ends up being the case with the Missouri Compromise, and as my kids know, I end up going way longer than I should. This guy named Henry Clay, he proposes compromise, and he says, look, let's make Missouri a state. It can be a slave state. We're going to add Maine as a new state, and it will be a free state. Maine is way up at the top. Again, I hope my cursor works. It's way up here at the top. It at one time was a part of Massachusetts, I think. So they made that a state so that you got 12 free states, 12 slave states, and then along with it in the Missouri Compromise, they said, let's make a line of latitude and say from this day forward, if you become a state, if you're above that line of latitude, 36 degrees, 30 or 30, however you say that, north, if you're above it, you have to be a free state. If you're below it, you're going to be a slave state. Now, if you look at this map, guys, because of the Louisiana Purchase, at this time, in this map, the colored sections of orange, green, and blue, though, that's the United States of America. Everything over here on the left to the west doesn't belong to the United States yet. So that is the United States of America at this time. And you can see where, that's right, T-couple, right? I mean,
would you try clicking present on the slides? It might blow it up, and
it will. It might be a little hard for me to get back out of it, but I did that a second ago. Yeah, you can. You look at it this way, you definitely see it bigger. Mm-hmm. So don't you think the southern states were already a little unhappy with this idea because they knew all of this land? I mean, we made those states, the only land to still make into states was going to be north of the line of 36 north.
True. Yeah. So yeah, everything you said was correct. So really who it benefited was the Missouri Compromise benefited the North. As you can see, most of the territory in the North is going to be applied for new statehood would be in the North. So when we talk about the Mexican American War, and which is that gray area where the Spanish rule is to the left or the west, then
let me interrupt you. Do you see my mouse?
Yeah.
Okay, so when I do this, you're seeing that. So I'm hoping you can see that. Okay.
I think we've talked about the Missouri Compromise in depth.
All right. Nat Turner's Rebellion. This one's me too. Nat Turner's Rebellion was in 1831. So later on, there was a slave named Nat Turner, and he organized this massacre, this big old rebellion. He got together and they escaped, and then they started killing white people in Virginia. There were 60-ish white Virginians that were killed by approximately 70 slaves. There was a 2-day event of terror in Virginia, and finally the Virginia militia, each state kind of at this time had their own little army, with the idea that if each state's army or militia needed to come together and fight another country, they could. That's kind of how the whole ordeal happened with fighting against the British, was that the militias from each state or colony at the time joined together. But the Virginia militia, not the United States Army, was able to put an end to the rebellion. And when it was all said and done, you had 55 slaves, including Nat Turner. They were tried and probably easily found guilty. And then they were executed. They were hanged. Nearly 200 more slaves were lynched. And T-couple did you get killed if you got lynched?
Yeah.
I mean, dead? Yeah. But can you believe someone ringing my doorbell? 200 more slaves were killed. And then they made new laws about limiting tightening up slavery, and to make sure that they couldn't escape, and reminding white people that you can't educate them. You got anything else to say? I'm going to run and find out who's at my door.
Yeah, that's fine. No, just the fact that these laws were made, they're called slave for the South, and these slave codes were strictened. And so Northerners definitely disagreed with the idea that slaves couldn't, one of the slave codes was slaves couldn't get in groups of more than 10. Obviously, slaves can't own weapons. Slaves can't, unless it's led and overseen by a white plantation owner or someone on the plantation. So these codes were real strict. After Nat Turner's Rebellion, a lot of Southerners were fearful, And so these laws were made out of fear to keep slaves, to keep them from rebelling in the future. So as Mr. Carnahan's going to check his front door, I'm going to talk about our next slide. And guys, thank you so much for listening. We only got 2 more. So we only got 2 more slides, and then we're going to call it a day. The next slide is going to be about the Wilmot Proviso, which really isn't even in a book, but I definitely think it's important to talk about. This David Wilmot was a congressman from Pennsylvania, and what he did was he tried to pass some legislation that would eliminate slavery within the land to be acquired the Mexican-American War. Mr. Carnahan, if you can hear me, you need to turn to the next slide.
Okay.
And so what he did was he put this on the end of a bill. He attached a rider, is what it's called. And so on the rider, it said, in the Mexican-American War, whatever the new territory is, there can be absolutely no slavery. And because he put this at the end of a bill, the bill was supposed to be for $2 million to be used to end the Mexican-American War. So this is like a tumultuous time, and it's an important bill. And this guy in the North is like, hey, let's attach this little thing at the very end that says we're going to get rid of slavery and all of the territory that is won during this Mexican-American War. The South was super mad, very frustrated. The North obviously wanted it to pass. They were trying to be sneaky and slide this in, but the divide between the North and the South just was much more. It was they started to hate each other even more. And it reminds me a little bit, Mr. Carnahan, maybe we could talk about it for just a minute, about how we do business in Congress today. Like when we're trying to pass an immediate appropriations bill for the American people during this COVID-19, and then the Democrats want to at the very end that says, let's add some fuel emissions and let's get rid of some carbon in the atmosphere. And the Republicans are like, hey, let's throw a little bit of money in this direction.
Yeah, that's, again, that whole compromise thing we talked about, and it's unfortunate. And Mr. Teacup and I spent a lot of time talking about stuff that you all would think is completely boring, but about that very thing is unfortunately, that stimulus, we have this unbelievable pandemic going on, and we decide, okay, we're going to close the country down. All these millions of people are not going to work. They're not making money. Let's give them money. And we just think, wow, they should have gotten together, figured out how to handle that. And it should have been not real complicated, but both sides, neither one is not guilty of this. Both sides have their own little things, their own little agendas, things that they want that they try to include in it. And then therefore it takes a bit longer to get everything done, to try to work through those issues of what they want. And I'm sure at the end of the day, both sides are if you watch the news, you can probably find Democrats complaining about what the Republicans are doing with that package, and the Republicans complaining about what the Democrats want or added in the package.
All right, so the last thing I need to say is the Wilmot Proviso passed in the House, and then it was blocked in the Senate. So now you can see how important that Senate is when each state gets 2 senators. If a state goes to be a slave state, how adding 2 senators could just throw the whole thing, and all the legislation in the future can then go pro-slavery, or if 2 are added to the free soil or to the North, then it could be anti-slavery legislation. One last slide, y'all. Here we go. All right, so it's the Compromise of 1850. Notice that gray territory is now United States territory. And so California wants to they apply for statehood. California wants to apply for statehood, and they want to apply for a free state, which is definitely going to take that balance the slave states are not going to like it. So what happens is,
hey, hold up. While I was first off, the reason that I had the knocking on the door was because, thank God, two of my neighbor kids came and said, "Do you know your dog is in your truck?" Well, my dog, when I went outside, you and I were texting. So it's from the time we stopped texting, I had gone outside to do something, and my dog now has learned that if she can get in my truck, she will. So she wants to go for a ride. So she gets in my truck. I don't know how but the door closed. Well, then I came and I took a shower. I did some other things. All of this time, that dog's been sitting in my truck with the windows up. And thankfully, I mean, it might have killed the dog. Thankfully, my neighbors noticed it. So she's now panting and drinking water. So anyway, I say all that, but
geez, Darren,
I know, almost killed my dog. So the kids didn't say anything about the fact that, we talked about Missouri Compromise and the United States was this big. And now when we talk about this compromise of 1850, the United States is much bigger. Did you say anything about, that we added because of the war with Texas?
Yeah, the Mexican-American War in that Utah territory, that New Mexico territory in California, that whole area that used to be gray on that other map is now 2 orange territories, and that green California. That's all added. So yeah, now I'm going into the whole the silver-tongued Henry Clay, the guy who likes to put together these compromises. By the way, Henry Clay is toward the end of his time here. Stephen Douglas, who's going to be important in the next 4, 5, 6 years from the 1850s on, because he's going to go against Abraham Lincoln. They're going to have those Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen Douglas is definitely pro-slavery. Anyways, they broker an agreement that California will be admitted to the Union as a free state under some circumstances, and this is a pretty big compromise, and there's a lot going on here. So I'm gonna try to spell it out real clear. The expansion of slavery into Utah and New Mexico is going to be determined by popular sovereignty. So the people there that live there, they get to determine. So that's kind of dangerous because if people from the South move to that region and they all want slavery, which they would if they're from the South, then they can vote and have that be a slave state. Vice versa, the North, people who move from the North to that territory could do the same. It basically meant this new thing called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act is actually written into the Constitution. We don't get to talk about this that much. Basically saying that if there's an escaped laborer who is owned by the state, which is a slave, they need to be returned. A lot of states don't follow that, even though it's part of the Constitution. They didn't follow it too closely. This strengthened the Compromise of 1850, strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act. Basically what it said was all slaves need to be returned, and we're going to provide an incentive. I think our American, The Story of Us, talks about $10 was given to a federal officer if a slave was returned. So there was an incentive, there was a business going on to return slaves to the South. Now, part of that, which is a little confusing, is you don't even have to be a slave. You just have to be accused of being a slave. And what also happened was slaves couldn't have a trial by jury. So a lot of times what happened was there were some black people who were captured who were not slaves, and they were taken to the South because there was a monetary incentive. There was a $10 incentive. California becomes a free state. The slave trade is outlawed in Washington, D.C., and popular sovereignty is going to decide whether Utah and the New Mexico territory is going to become a slave state or a free state. That is the compromise.
Yeah.
What you got, Mr. Carnahan?
Yeah, just pretty wild that there were people. So guys would be hired to go into free states, and the idea was they're going up into those free states and they're looking for runaway slaves. But in the end, and I know I don't know if either of us showed. They would take black. There were black people that lived in the North that were not slaves, and they were never slaves, and it turned into a thing where they would capture, basically kidnap black people in the North and take them back. They'd take them down to the South and make them slaves. That was all part of that Fugitive Slave Act. It was a horrible thing.
Yes, it was. And so that leads us, Mr. Carnahan. I think we're going on I think like 20 minutes. I think it's way too long. Kids are going to hate us.
I know it. We can be done with this. What we'll do, guys, is when we'll have one more of these where we're going to talk about a couple other things that led to what's the Civil War is going to be. And then both of us are finishing out the year with two Ed puzzles that are both from America, the Story of Us, on the Civil War. So other than taking up 20 minutes of your time, that's about what we're talking about. Those two Civil War videos, about how long are each one of those?
It's about 20 minutes each, so it'll be a total of 40 minutes. But I forgot to mention, you guys need to be thinking about what you think that main cause of the Civil War is. Mr. Carnahan and I have talked a lot. Slavery is obviously at the hold, but there's a lot of debate today, whether slavery or was it states' rights, or was it more of a federal government versus states issue? Was it the regional differences? Was it the economical differences? So, try to think of your own explanation.
And I am going to hit this, so it may kind of end abruptly, but I'm going to hit this and see if it'll stop.
All right, see y'all. Bye.
Peace.